So if you asked me a few years ago, before I started really doing the B5 Ruminations, what my least favorite episodes are, two would come to mind immediately. Grey 17 is Missing, and the Deconstruction of Falling Stars. I don't like this episode, in hindsight, in retrospect. I really should, I'm sorry, I should use my terminology properly there. I didn't like this episode, and then when people are like, oh my god, are you going to do a lamentation on Grey 17, or are you going to do a lamentation on Deconstruction? I'm like, I don't actually know yet, because I never decide that until I'm actually there. Now, for those of you who've been following this series, which, statistically speaking, if you're watching this video, includes you, you know that I didn't actually give a lamentation to Grey 17 is Missing. While the half of the plot involving Grey 17 was bad, it was nowhere near lamentation worthy, and then the other half of the plot was pretty good. That brings us to Deconstruction. Let me first explain why I didn't like it so much. It's because I don't like this type of science fiction in general. Never have. I don't like it when you take something and you look at the really, really long view. It completely divorces me from caring about what's going on at all. If you do a story about the millennias of man and the trillions of years as these life forms go out about billions of things and these empires which rise and fall across the million, my interest level just goes away. I'm just like, okay, yep, sure, that's great, whatever. And that's just a personal preference thing, nothing really against it. I could argue that it has to do with the general psychology of preferring something down to the level. I mean, Lord knows one of the things I tend to espouse most often is the idea of the Morden effect, a.k.a. you need, Morden from Mass Effect, not in other words, it needs to be personal. It needs to be something you can acknowledge, something you can recognize. Favorite nephew, right? But and of course I love the Lower Decks tile story, so that's awesome too. Being able to look at something and be like, oh man, here's something from a newer, lower perspective. That's great. But I think the other reason it really divorces me, if I was to give a specific reasoning for it other than just preference, it's because most of the time it doesn't mean anything. Like, again, this is not a universal thing, but most stories that do the billions of years type thing, or the, here's the path of this alien race across millennia, and here's the rise and fall and rise and fall and rise and fall of all these empires, they don't do anything with the story. They just showcase history. Like, here's history. And that's not that interesting to me. I mean, real life history is interesting to me, because it actually happened, or at least, well, we'll get to that. Now, all of that being said, this episode did actually kind of do something, but upon rewatching it, I think this episode, this is just opinion, and I have nothing to back this up whatsoever, other than my own speculation and the analysis of the episode. I think JMS just had a few story ideas he wanted to get out there. Now, in his comments, which I actually have over there on the left, he mentioned how he had been doing some work for a completely unrelated story at the time, which kind of put some of these ideas in his head, most notably the monks thing. But that kind of is what the whole story struck me as if he wanted to just tell a few last stories and didn't have time to really tell them, so he basically condensed all of them, all of those ideas, all of those concepts into short story format and tossed them out into this episode, because that's what this feels like to me. A bunch of basically unconnected short stories that have no real thematic significance or connection between each other than the connection of history. Not even a specific brand of history, either. We've got interpretation of history, we've got deliberate manipulation of history, we've got the ways that history can affect the future. It's all just history, and that's not really a common thread any more than fiction is a common thread. At a certain point, it stops being a common thread and starts being, yeah, okay, whatever. Not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but I think that's why I'm not going to be quite as harsh on this episode as I was back in the time. Obviously, this is not a lamentation. You know that because you saw it in the title. It would say lamentation, and I would have a different intro, and everything would be dark and doomy and gloomy. I wouldn't have this background up either. The other thing I want to comment on really quick, obviously, for those of you not aware, this episode kind of got rejiggered after the TNT renewing Season 5 thing, which I swear we're going to talk about Season 5 next week, or tomorrow. The next episode, we'll be talking about season 5. But this one got rejiggered, basically. Rearranged so that it lands here instead of elsewhere, whereas it was originally intended to be elsewhere. So, for anybody curious, that's why. And in many ways, this was designed to be a series ender. And I could kind of see that. I could really see this being the series finale in a way that, honestly, the actual series finale doesn't quite live up to. As weird as that sounds. As much as this is a series of basically unconnected short stories, as I mentioned earlier, there are several things that are very definitive. Sheridan and Delenn, arguably the main characters of the story, won. They did it. They accomplished the impossible 3 times, actually. Peace has been made. The Interstellar Alliance exists. They are now backing it with the full might and power of their politics and their militaries. They have the ability to be together for the last 19 years or however much they've got left at this point. All sorts of stuff like that. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't more stories to tell, and Season 5 kind of proves this, but it felt like if the story, if Babylon 5 had ended here, several things would have reached a natural narrative conclusion. And I'm okay with that. But let's move on to the episode itself. Now, there's 2 points here which kind of irritate me. There are 2 things where I took down, jotted down a note here, and I was like, okay, this is something that I want to talk about. And then within the next minute, they actually said it outright in the episode, and I'm like, oh, come on, you can't do that. The 2 things are, I wanted to talk about the irony of Sheridan and the reasoning behind the political commentary. The irony of Sheridan is the fact that Sheridan is not a guy who likes to be in the spotlight. He does not want to be someone who is on the pedestal, who is in charge, and who is doing all these things. He wants to just do his job and get on with it. He accepted responsibility because of the kind of person he is. And it's funny to me how many people revere and hold Sheridan up on a pedestal, given how he has never wanted that, and indeed still doesn't. Just to diverge for a second, a lot of people don't understand that there's a really big difference between wanting something and accepting something. Sheridan very clearly accepted the role and tasks put upon him, but didn't actually embrace them. At no point do I personally feel throughout season 1 through 4 that Sheridan was like, yes, I will be this great, glorious leader. Instead, it was like, okay, I will be this great, glorious leader. Tone matters. The other thing was the political commentary. So fast forward a century. Or no, it wasn't a century. Sorry, we're not at that step yet. Fast forward a bit, and they're having a news thing. They've got 3 people. This is actually right after the episode. 3 people are sitting there, and they're like, hey. And one of them is clearly a pot stirrer. There's probably a proper political term for that. That's what I call it. Because people like that tend to make the best people like that tend to make legitimate points that have actual reasoning behind them. However, the only reason they're bringing it up is to stir the pot. And therefore, their argument is actually invalid because they're not making an argument. They have no presentation that they care about. All they care about is stirring the pot. And then there's people who make stupid points and are just trying to stir the pot. This guy probably fits in the latter category, but a little bit better than the first. And I'm sitting here scritching down, why is it, why doing this? And I started writing my notes, and then the woman in the trio flat out says, by the way, he was a speechwriter for the Clark administration and the Clark party. And I'm like, the party that supported Clark. I'm like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. Now, one thing I find absolutely amusing here, if I may, is that, I need to pop my neck, is that they never actually say the political party that Clark and his regime was. I mean, you could say it's the fascists, obviously, but you get my point, right? They never call them the Leftinians. So I've decided to start calling them Clarkists, if that's okay with everyone. But they never call that out. Good move, actually, because any word you use is probably going to be associated with some kind of actual political party and have people go, rah! So just completely sidestep that. However, the subtler, more insidious, more horrifying reality is that means that the Clarkists are still there. Let me make this point clear. Clark has basically become a acceptable target for a lot of crap that's been happening. He's basically become Hitler, right? I don't mean as in he grew a stash and started genociding people. I mean a lot of people place all of the crap on him rather than on the Nazi Party or on the Clark administration. There's a reason, as I said before, there's a reason I keep going and trying to call them the Clark administration rather than trying to focus on Clark himself. And the Clarkists who supported him and were part of the Clark administration are still there and are still in sufficient power to have the kind of influence and sway to have this guy on the show, first of all, but second of all, to be running in the election. Now, your reaction to that is probably going to depend entirely on how you think of it or how you feel, but I imagine it's going to be one of two general concepts. You're either going to be like, oh my god, that's horrible, which is my gut reaction, or you're going to look at it and say, well, yeah, of course they are. However cynical you wish to be about that, please feel free. But it's kind of funny to think about. Also, I really enjoy I enjoy the drift from that, and we go forward a century, and then there's two people sitting there, and in the former thing there were three people, right? This is almost too obvious, narratively speaking, but it gets its point across, so I don't mind. In the first news broadcast, we have three people. One who is firmly with Sheridan in terms of support. One who is neutral. Maybe we shouldn't be pro-Sheridan, but maybe we should give him a chance. And one who is very anti-Sheridan, right? Skip forward 100 years, and we have two people, both of whom are anti-Sheridan and Delenn, but simply take different tacts on exactly how they think they were wrong. One of them says, oh, well, this is clearly just lies and propaganda, and the other one says, well, no, this is clearly just a misunderstanding and reimagining of history and blah, blah, blah. I also love how one of the two people there, and Lord knows we all make this mistake, in fact, I do this myself sometimes and I try to catch myself, will present opinion as fact, and then argue as if the opinion was fact. And again, we all do that. I do it too. I try not to do it when I'm disparaging people by calling them power-hungry, pathological maniacs, though. Pretty sure I've never actually done that. Usually I'm like, Kafka was awesome, and therefore Kafka was awesome. But she does this. She absolutely slams Sheridan and insists on this myth, and then Delenn basically makes her way onto the stage. Now, funny fact, it's actually easier than you'd probably think to do what Delenn does. JMS himself actually commented on this, but I've actually had people do this on a news broadcast. It's so easy, especially if you're already someone who has some kind of backing or veneration or is Delenn. What I love about that scene of Delenn popping on there, in addition to the fact that it was a live broadcast, is the fact that Delenn didn't come up there to debate them or to unveil the truth. She pretty much says that flat out. She just wanted to say Sheridan was a good man. For all that he has done, and let's be clear, Sheridan is a hero. For all that he has done, for all that he has accomplished, for all that has happened as a result of him and their actions, the only thing Delenn felt was worthy of remembrance a century later, 80 years after his passing, was that he was a good man. That is so Minbari and so Delenn in particular. I just love that. I love that. I don't have anything else to say about that. It's just interesting. One other point, if I may, really quick. They bring something up. They mention that an individual cannot accomplish, that all an individual can do is to allow others to accomplish. I obviously don't agree with that. Individuals can accomplish quite a bit. But the other reason I don't agree with that is because it's a self-defeating argument. Because if an individual cannot accomplish, then simply being allowed to accomplish does not allow you to accomplish because the individual cannot accomplish. Kind of defeats our own argument. And it's one of those things, I'm sure there's a proper term for this. One of these days I'm going to have a bigger vocabulary, and I'm going to be awesome on this show. You guys watch. Instead of some moron who's dribbling, trying to get the ideas out of his mouth at you. But I've seen this type of argument before. It's when someone sits down and presents a complicated idea, which is complex without being convoluted, and therefore is presented as if it is smart. However, when you deconstruct it, is actually either self-defeating or actively stupid. Usually provably wrong, too. It's the type of thing you do either to convince people who aren't bothering to think for themselves on the matter, or who aren't thinking too carefully about what they're saying, or, and this is how I most often see it presented, and this is what I believe she was doing in the episode, you present it in such a way that, well, obviously this is true. Only an idiot would think otherwise, right? In other words, present this argument as if it is the intellectual thing to say, and because we, in the culture we exist within, and this has been true for some time, venerate intellect, for obvious reasons, we don't want to not be intellectual. We don't want to be stupid. There's a reason the word stupid is usually used as a generic insult, right? Therefore, you don't want to be perceived as not being on the same intellectual level as the person giving the argument, and therefore you immediately capitulate so that you are then venerated through the social circle that you're going through the social interaction, to the same level of intellect that the person giving the argument is on. Because now you agree with it, and therefore, obviously, you're on the same tier. I just want to slug everybody I see doing that, by the way. Oh, BAM! Not literally. I don't like punching people. In fact, I don't think I've punched someone since I was in first grade. It's been a really long time, guys. Anyways, I've punched punching bags. Does that count? So she comes up and is like, hey. Now, then we jump forward a bit to my personal favorite section, and the one part of the episode I absolutely adore. They recreate the actual holograms of Franklin, Sheridan, Garibaldi, and Delenn, and then they reprogram them in certain ways to present them as evidence in support of their particular political cause. It happens to be a fairly important one, but it doesn't have to be. It could just be any old cause. But in this case, this is about a form of insurrection and military opposition to the Alliance, to the Interstellar Alliance, which is kind of a bad idea in many ways. A couple things to comment on. First of all, this is brilliant from an out-of-character perspective, because it means your main characters can be present in a show that's not about them. You can still have all the actors playing those characters under these circumstances, despite the fact that they are basically playing holograms of themselves, right? Second reason I love this is that it's an interesting insight into, shall we say, the flawed mentality of military tacticians in general. I want to cover that separately. That's kind of its own issue. And the third thing I want to talk about is how freaking awesome it is. I love how it's Garibaldi's brain. So in many ways that basically is Garibaldi, right? And so, they reprogram Sheridan, and he orders the mass execution of people because, we're trying to show how evil they are. And then they reprogram Franklin to be just cartoonishly, sickeningly evil, talking about wanting to drug up children so that they will live longer, so that they can vivisect them while they're alive. I mean, just cartoonishly, horrifically evil. And then Garibaldi is basically last, and he's sitting there, and he's been paying attention this whole time. And again, it's Garibaldi's brain. And he's smart, and he's the detective. I've talked about this so many times. So he figures out how to use the access he has as a hologram. He embraces the fact that he's a hologram. Talks his way through the situation, manages to explain what's going on, gets the guy to spill the beans, gets the message out, and it works. Garibaldi's hologram ends the insurrection and saves millions of civilians. I love that. And then there's this wonderful scene that's actually kind of heart touching of heartwarming. That is touching, where Garibaldi goes over to the other holograms, who at this point have already been reprogrammed and are just standing there blank-faced, and says, well, guys, rest easy. Because not only will they have saved all those lives, but their likenesses will not have been used in a perverted, horrific fashion in order to perpetuate a great wrong. And people like Sheridan and Delenn and Franklin, and Garibaldi actually, they picked the four most morally centric characters in order to do this on, would have hated the idea of their likeness being used to do such a horrific act. And then the missiles come in, and there's this great bit where Garibaldi's like, well, you're not on a military installation, are you? And the guy's like, oh God, it just bolts. Oh, I love that scene. I want to talk about military tactics really quick. I don't want to talk about terrorism right now. I know that's a weird thing to comment on, but the terrorism discussion can wait until TNG actually is when we're going to talk about terrorism, because there's an episode that does a really good job of not talking about it in a good way. We'll get there. Like next year. God. Don't worry. I keep this stuff in the back of my mind. Don't worry. I always remember this kind of thing. I think I've proven that at this point. What I want to talk about is civilian targets. Now, historically speaking, and in my opinion, this is what going after civilian targets means. I'm glad I caught that because I'm recording right now and that almost hit the mic. Boom. Heads or tails? Historically speaking, there really are only two reactions to a military attack on a civilian populace. We either have instantaneous capitulation because they lack the ability or function to deal with it, and they're terrified, which is what is intended, by the way, or you get the Battle of Britain. Now, there have been a lot of other examples of that, but that's such a relatively recent thing and a well-documented, well-understood, well-versed part of history that we all know that going after civilian targets during the Battle of Britain, during the bombing of England, was a really, really dumb idea of the Nazi Germany, and did so much to unite the people against them, because you don't frickin' do that, right? And this is, again, this has been true historically across almost all war and across all history. You go after a civilian populace, you piss them off. People who were weary or resigned or were just, all right, we'll give up, will get angry if you start murdering civilians, if you start attacking unacceptable military targets. I bring this up because that's one of the things the Clark administration did, if you'll remember. They didn't just limit their campaign to going after their military enemies within the Mars group, for example, or any of the colonies. No, they went after civilian targets. In fact, that is what eventually drove Sheridan and Ivanova to push back against them. It was never stated outright, but I always believed that those civilian targets, those civilian casualties, are pretty much what allowed the, shall we say, overwhelming wave of support for the insurrection to happen. Because, no. And I don't have a better way to say that. Because, no. Even if you take morals and ethics out of it, bombing civilian centers is basically expending military time, resources, and personnel on ensuring that the enemy's military time, personnel, and resources are not getting expended. I mean, yeah, they might try to defend, but you get my point. You are not taking out a military factory. You are not taking out a military installation. Their military capacity doesn't go down if you kill people in cities. Now, their industrial capacity could go down, their economic capacity could go down, but their ability to turn around and hit you back has not gone down. Or, to really break this analogy down, if you punch someone just right in the shoulder, you can really hurt their ability to punch you back. I've actually done boxing and taekwondo in the past, if you're wondering where this is coming from. You get them right there, you hurt their ability to hurt you, and now they can't hurt you as much. If you kick them in the balls, you piss them off. Moving on. There's a couple of the things they talk about, good facts, true facts. I don't actually have much to say about this other than the fact that I like the ideas that are presented here. I mentioned the recurring theme of history and how it's perceived, or rather the lack of recurring theme. In this case, what we are seeing is deliberate history manipulation for a deliberate point and purpose. Because, and this is true in real life too, we tend to take certain things as more credible. Let me use a weird example. This is completely made up. Let's say aliens, Vulcans just landed in Moscow. Boom, right now, okay? Now, if I'm talking to you, and I don't even know you, like I'm just a stranger on the street and say, hey, Vulcans just landed in Moscow, you're not going to believe me. It's true, but you're not going to believe me. Now, let's say you hear from a friend of yours, still probably a little inclined to look into it, right? Well, what if you see a news broadcaster saying it? What if you say a news broadcaster who you happen to follow or trust? What if you hear a a live report? Now, it's obvious why we consider certain sources of information more credible, but as history has shown, it is surprisingly easy to manipulate that by presenting credible information, or rather more credible information, by buying the right people or going to the right ends in order to make something seem more reasonable. Now, if this sounds like a bad example, let me give you a slightly different analogy to explain the same point. Let us say that there's some false information, okay? It is false. Truthfully speaking, it is falsified information. Now, let us say that someone gets up there who you have no idea who this person is, and they don't really know what they're talking about, but they say it's false, and here's why, dot, dot, dot. And they give the reasons why it's false, okay? The truthful, factual reasons. Now let's say, same group, or different group, depending on how we want to control group this, sees a professional who has a piece of paper that says, I am a certified, there's actually a term for this, someone who verifies facts. There's a term for that. Someone who looks into things and certifies whether or not something is debated as factual or not, right? Okay, this is a computing thing. I can't freaking think of the name of it. I'm sorry. I told you, one of these days, guys, I'll be amazing on camera. I swear. You get this guy up there, and he says, well, yes. And he says the same thing. This is not true, and this is why, dot, dot, dot. Same information, same general presentation, but one of those guys has a degree and a background and a job and a title and a piece of paper that says, I know what I'm doing. The other guy doesn't. You are more likely to find the second source more credible, right? And again, this isn't me yelling. This isn't me preaching. It is logical that people would try to find more credible information and would use things like this as a way to do that. All of this has been a way to discuss the fact that this is a very logical situation that probably shouldn't be changed, at least not in the current circumstances, because we all have to apply this kind of credibility study to every bit of information that comes into us every day. We all do this constantly, whether we know it or not. But understanding how and why it works, understanding that you find these things more credible, you can understand how to manipulate that. And we've seen that in Babylon 5 with the Clark administration. If it's not obvious yet, I'm drawing a lot of parallels between the Clark administration and whoever these guys are in the future, because there's a lot of parallels there. The Clark administration kept bringing in, trained psychologists from this person, from this university, and this person from this place, who's this thing, credibility. I call that buying cred. That's literally just what I call that. Sometimes companies do it to sell games or as part of a marketing ploy. Sometimes companies do it in order to try and get new customers, as in completely unrelated to the video gaming industry. I've seen this done so many times in real life. It's so logical to see them then use what they have at their disposal, because they went out of their way to say these are the actual, this is the actual people. This is actually Sheridan. This is actually their brain patterns, their knowledge. And then we have this discussion and conversation so you understand and can see that, yes, these are actually these people. Then we go off camera for a second, reprogram them, and then we have them replicate the thing. So now you think it is more credible because that's actually Sheridan. It's kind of horrifying when you think about it. And then Garibaldi outsmarts him because he's Garibaldi and he's awesome. Anyways. So then we get the Holy Monk section, which I don't have a lot to talk about other than the fact that it's good. It's all good stuff. This is yet another take on history. See, I suppose I should be talking about this. The first take on history was present history. How do we interpret what has just happened? How do we look at it and try to move it where we want it to be? Because all three of those perspectives, the for, the neutral, and the against, we're all trying to sway the conversation and sway the other presenters, and thereby the viewers, to their viewpoint. How do we take history and tilt the creek wherever we need that water to go? Second take on history with the two was, well, how do we showcase our particular position? How do we showcase our superiority, our credibility, our... They never say this outright, but I've always had the impression, and I very much had that this time with analysis mode on, that as they're sitting there debating this, as the two are debating this, this is basically just well, I'm not going to say what it actually is because that would be crude, and I don't like talking about that stuff on my show, but ego stroking. This is two people who are trying to prove that, yeah, no, we're intellectual, we're smart, we are, yes, yes, as anybody can tell you, I don't smoke. That's terrible. As anybody can tell you, puff, puff. This is clearly an example of... I do absolutely think that... And I've noticed this in real life as well. A lot of people who do that sort of thing are doing... specifically do it to go against whatever is considered acceptable or popular or normal. It's in other words, a high-class hipster is basically what it is. Showing how superior you are, showing how smart you are, showing how intellectual you are, by saying, oh yes, insert popular thing here is terrible and here's why. Yes, yes, definitely. I don't know how to smoke, so I don't know if I'm doing the right motions here. Help me out, guys. So that was trying to use history as a tool for personal use. Now that may sound like the same thing, but what I mean by that is the history itself wasn't relevant. Delenn herself called that out. They weren't interested in history. They weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in showing how much better they were than all the other historians and all the other debaters and all the other political analysts. They were better. Third take on history was deliberate, like active revisionism. Straight up Stalinism going on right there. Like, just, no, we're going to rewrite the books, we're going to rewrite this, and it will say exactly what we need it to say, and it will work. And I love the brilliant irony, by the way, that in all three of these timelines, the intentions of these people have been subverted in some way or another. The most obvious one, of course, being Garibaldi, who is like, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm still jazzing about that scene, it's such a great scene. Then we get to the next era. Now, it's obvious to surmise what happened. Earth, they mentioned that Earth is not allowed to go to the stars. So it's not that they lack the capacity. It's not that they lack the thoughts or ability to progress. They are, in fact, working on that actively. They are being restricted. They live in villages. You know, humanity has been brought down. It's so easy to see what could have happened as an interstellar alliance goes back against Earth, after Earth just threatened to kill millions of civilians. I mean, you see where this is coming from. And, and of course, we could also see that the Rangers, who, of course, have human people as well as are probably still present in the Interstellar Alliance, have people present to try and help work with them, guide them, and based on the conversation have been slowly introducing technology to move humanity forward while still trying to guide them and ensure that things don't happen the way they did. Cool with it. Here, history is being seen... I guess the word I want to use here is as an excuse. They talk more about faith, about these people as if they were holy people, as if they were part of some kind of book of... What's another word for book? I don't know, something like that, you know, some kind of book that contains all these scriptures and all these words from ancient past, and whether these people actually existed or not, or whether this is serving a purpose or not. But we see that the history there is being presented pretty much solely as a mirror upon which you can look upon, I swear I can structure my sentences, that which you can look upon, and as you're staring therein, determine what it is you wish to see. We see this in the, for lack of a better term, crisis of faith in the younger man, and we see this in the older man who is quite steady in what he's doing and why. And then we cut to the Vorlon, the human. And I don't even have anything to add to this. The symmetry of the humanity basically reaching Vorlon state is so obvious and so apparent, I don't even have anything to say about it. It's there. I do like we're sending out this data probe thing so that our history can be recorded and known, so that people know where we've come from, right? Couple final thoughts. First of all, I want to quote something, word for word, dedicated to all the people who predicted the Babylon Project would fail in its mission. Faith manages. I'm going to read this word for word, so forgive me for going off for a bit. This is JMS. A few people have interpreted the final card as mean-spirited, when it's on one level a reaction to 5 years of constant carping and mean-spiritedness from lots of sectors, from the nets, the press, and elsewhere. But what it is a statement of hope. that whenever you try something different, there are going to be naysayers and people who say it can't be done, and it certainly can't be done by you. But it ain't just B5, it's any dream out there, and in the end, they are wrong. Faith manages. That is the message of the card. That, and the truth that in 10 years, which were past already, by the way, naysayers will be forgotten and made irrelevant, but the show goes on, and will be around long after they and I have gone to dust. And all people will know when they see that card, 50 years from now, that some jerks said it couldn't be done, and they were wrong. Because they are always wrong. If you have the dream, the ability, the passion, you can bring your dreams to life despite overwhelming opposition. That is the message. And I like that. And I had to admit, I wanted to quote that word for word because I don't even remember how long it's been since this episode came out. I suppose I could look it up really quick. But it has been quite a few years since this episode came out. Here we go. October 27th, 1997. I don't feel like doing the months, but that's... Wow, that's about 20 years ago now. Just under 20 years ago now. A few months under. That's impressive. And Babylon 5 is still here and is still my favorite show of all time. And I'd like to think is an awesome show for at least some of you because you're watching me talk about it. This might be one of my longer episodes. I didn't intend it for it to be, but I hope you've enjoyed. See you next time. For real now with Season 5.